My name is Paul Beaudoin. I am an American citizen who is now living permanently in Estonia. I was born in Miami, Florida, kind of a small section of Florida, but I spent most of my professional life in Boston, Massachusetts, where I went to school at the New England Conservatory of Music, where I got a master's degree, and then later a PhD at Brandeis University. And I spent maybe most of that time as a teacher of art and of music at several institutions in Boston. And, well, from there the story gets a little more complicated. Maybe before I talk about the exhibition, I might talk a little bit about how I even got back to painting. Before I left Miami for Boston, I actually had a chance to go to a very nice school in New York, and my determination at that time was to be a performance artist, somebody who deals with music and deals with dance and deals with film and poetry and visual art. And during my time there, I had an exhibition, and a critic came from the very famous Yale University. And what she said to me was really kind of a life-changing moment. And after seeing my works, she came up to me and she said, "I'm sorry, Paul, but you're not a painter." And I asked why. How did she imagine this as a valid criticism? And she told me that my brushstrokes went in every imaginable direction and that this was absolutely not acceptable. I can't tell you as a young artist how powerful that was to me in changing the direction my life was headed in. So at that moment, literally at that moment, I decided to stop painting and stop making film and stop making poetry, and I devoted myself to only making music. So when I left Miami to go to Boston, my goal was to be a music person. But I always had this thirst, this hunger for art. And I spent most of my time teaching art history, teaching about abstract expressionism, sort of the American school. And it wasn't until I began coming to Estonia that this flower of my feeling for painting was nourished. So really this exhibition is an example of how my moving to Estonia has reawakened something very deep and very hidden and was really sleeping for many, many decades. These works are all about this neighborhood that I have settled in. I now live in Kalamaja, and many, many times a week I'm walking from Kalamaja into Noblessner, and I'm looking at this historical area. I'm looking at how much change is happening here. Not only its rich historical past, but also how this past is being reshaped and transformed. And it became for me a kind of interesting topic to explore from a visual standpoint. So although all of these works here look abstract, they're all deeply connected to what you'll see when you walk in the Noblessner and the Kalamaja area. And later on, I'll kind of point out some very specific connections between what's out there and what's here. They're abstract, but in fact, in many ways, all things are abstract. Kohe, oled, kohal. For an American, this is difficult. But as I say, I walk in this neighborhood, and if you go very close by, there's a street that has a sign, and the sign is yellow, and it's actually for Linusadam, and it says, kohe, oled, kohal. Let's keep going. And at the time that I saw this, we were in lockdown, and I took this first as in, let's keep making art, let's keep moving, let's keep doing what we're supposed to be doing with our lives. But then I realized that the translation might also mean you're almost there. And to me, this was very poetic, because what this represented for me was that I had moved from the US to Estonia. I am here now. And so all of what I experience and what I want to reflect has to do about this change. And you are here now also means pay attention to what's around you. what are the colors? What are the smells? What are the textures? What are the sounds? How do these affect your everyday life? And in this period when we've been in lockdown and we've been able to go out and look at our world very differently, I think it's very important to pay attention to these things that we normally don't even think about. But these shapes, these colors, these sounds deeply influence our behavior, our feelings, our sense of who and what we are. So let's keep going. Let's keep exploring our inner worlds, even if we're blocked from being in very big social situations, and realize you are here now. What this means for me also is that that's just right now. Where you have been and where you might go could be very different. So in a way, this reflects a little bit on my spiritual take on life, in that you must live in this present moment. You can't change the past, and you can't really even influence the future. So be where you are right now. And that's another way of me thinking about these works, is that they are kind of moments of my life, and I'm trying to preserve them so that they're kind of like memory fragments. So it's a rather profound title. It's playful, but it means something. As I think when we talk about these titles, I think this will be kind of more revealing. I was very lucky to know ahead of time what the color schemes of the gallery was. So when I began to make these paintings, I was very conscious about the colors that these works would be on. So I make all of my own colors. I work in acrylics because they're very fast drying, but also because I can combine them and I can layer them. So when I began to think about these two colors, I thought about how do the colors of this Kalamaja and Noblessner, how can I use them to work with the colors that are inside the gallery? So while these are fixed, these gallery walls, they actually are a very important part to how these paintings work. Not that you need to have purple walls or gray walls in your home, but I'm thinking all the time, remember that art is about what we experience, what we see, what we hear. And so I'm thinking about these things, even if it's subconsciously, and they are having some subtle influence on how I make the work. And this is true whether I'm working with sound, or if I'm working with paint, or if I'm working with film. I'm constantly thinking about where are these works going to be seen, because I think the space is very, very important, because it plays a role in how we understand the work. So, yeah. I think I'm a very conscious person when it comes to projects, but how they develop can seem unconscious or without thought. I think why I talk about my experience wanting to be a performance artist and then having that cut from my life, I think what I find now is I want to recapture that enthusiasm, that drive, that feeling like, yes. What I find myself fascinated by is that I'm not just a painter, I'm not just a composer, I'm not just a filmmaker, I am all these things. And this kind of interdisciplinary approach to art is very freeing, because for me what's important is I have something I want to say in a kind of artistic or creative way, and I'm free to choose the medium for which this expression is best suited. So I may, for example, find that moving images, as we would call it, film, might be better suited for an expression, whereas these are kind of frozen moments in time. Sound is something very, very different. It's working with a different sense, it's working with ears, it's working with time. And so I'm very sensitive to how I choose to express myself. I think what I find is that as opportunities come, I think about how these opportunities allow me the chance to grow. So I am like a plant. I have roots now here in Estonia, but they're not just in Estonia. They are all over the world. And I think one of the things that's very important for a contemporary artist is to realize that your world is not closed. It's open. And we have to think about our art not only being, say, in Kalamaja or in Tallinn or in Pärnu or in Estonia, but you must think globally, because there's people all around the world who are kind of doing the same things. And so perspective about how your work fits into kind of a global context is so important, especially as we find our lives changing. Gallery spaces are changing, they're becoming more virtual. We find artists being influenced by social media. We find Facebook and Instagram and TikTok being platforms for expression that have become invaluable for spreading our idea. Imagine, the Renaissance Florentine painter who is only painting for a very small community, a very rich one. And of course, later they'll become global, but we must, as artists, realize we are immediately in a global platform. And so the more we learn, the more we experience, the more we expose ourselves and our artwork to the world, the richer we become in our ability to express it. So while it's great to have plans and it's great to have ideas, I try to be flexible in realizing that as opportunities come, they may shape a particular direction. And what can be interesting is sometimes this direction can be in a place that I had no idea. And so just by shaping this gives me new possibilities. They're not restrictions, they're not limitations, they're chances for your roots to grow. And if you can approach this from that kind of aspect, it's really quite beautiful. And to think that as this plant grows, it can grow in all directions. And that to me is kind of a nice thing to think about. I have many friends who are musicians, who are painters, who are poets, who are dancers, but they don't share their work. They work in their basement, they work in their studio, they work in their bedrooms with their digital equipment. And one of the things that I've realized as an educator, as somebody who's spent years talking about art, I've had to ask myself, and really this comes from my students, is why? Why does somebody make this? Why does somebody take the time to create a painting or to create a poem? And, I realized actually from anthropology, this is a study of cultures. There was a very famous woman, her name was Margaret Mead, and somebody once asked her, what were the necessary ingredients for making civilization? And she said, we really need 5 things. First, we need kind of a hunter and gatherer, somebody who's going to find food for our community. We need builders, somebody who's going to create places for us to be safe from the natural elements. We need kind of a healer, whether this is a doctor or a shaman. We need somebody who's going to mediate that world that we don't know from the world that we do know. We need the lawgivers, somebody who's going to help us decide what's right and what's wrong, whether this is your king or your president or your council of elders. And she said the last thing that we need are our storytellers. And it's the artist, it's the dancer, it's the musician who is the storyteller. And the responsibility of the storyteller is to hold the identity of our community. When your grandmother is telling you stories, she's sharing a history with you. She is, in a sense, a kind of artist. And so the artist's job is really to tell the stories in the times that they live. And I think all artists make art because there's an innate need to share. Whether you're just sharing it with family or with friends or a larger local community or with the world, I really think all of us, when we make art, we're trying to make expression. We have this desire for somebody else to say, I understand you. And so how we share is really limitless in a lot of ways. And now more than ever, we have so many opportunities to get our work out there so that the artist isn't invisible. And I think about this because I think for many years of my life, I was invisible as an artist. I was told that I wasn't a painter. And so somehow subconsciously, this kind of broke my, but I had such a deep need to express. And now that I have this chance, it's like an explosion. And I'm so grateful for that. So if you are making art, share it. Share it. So important. I'm not only a fan of, I am a student of one of the greatest creative minds of the 20th century. I'm a student of John Cage. I knew him for probably 25 years. We worked together many times, and for those of you that don't know him, I urge you to look into this amazing life of a creative person who dealt with film and dealt with art and dealt with poetry. He showed me that the artist is free to express in any way possible. And he was the most kindest and generous and profound person I had ever met. Not to mention, he's so famous. So he deeply influenced the way I thought about art. And not a day goes by that I don't think about John Cage in one way or another. But I'm inspired by so many artists. Robert Rauschenberg, an American abstract expressionist who did a lot of sort of collage, is very important to me. I've realized that a lot of the artists that I used to sort of look down on have actually become really important. And one of those, I think, is Andy Warhol, who I used to think as a kind of jokester. But I had a chance a few years ago to see an exhibition of his in Berlin, and I came across a small book that he had done of Prince, having to do with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And I was profoundly moved at how this artist was able to capture this moment of time and to tell us in images a very important story in history. But I'm also deeply influenced by music. I spent most of my years as a professional composer. And I had the chance when I was working at this college in New York to live with other composers and other painters. And what I realized was that the problem of the artist is the same. So we all are trying to solve the same problems. You'll find when I listen to music that I'm listening to people like Morton Feldman or John Cage, but I also listen to people like Björk. I've been watching the Eurovision Festival these past couple of days because that is a curiosity that we just don't have in America. So I really think the artist who is paying attention is influenced by all the things. And when we absorb our life, we're constantly shifting and figuring out what stays and what doesn't stay. But the list is long, and my list is ever changing. Because as I change as a person, so does what I want to see and what I want to hear. So what might have influenced me when I was 20 is very different from what's a part of my life now. You know, one of the things that I have to think about is I'm a new plant here in Estonia. So while I'm growing and rooting, I'm also learning about these different ways to grow. So what motivated me to come to Estonia first was its cultural landscape. I first started coming, I think, in 2009. And each year I came back and I stayed longer and longer. And in 2015, I had a chance to live here for the whole year as a part of the Fulbright Scholarship, which is a sort of a very nice program for people to live in other cultures. And having been here for that year, I saw things in Estonia that I hadn't seen elsewhere. For example, listening to Ervo Pärt in Nigulista Kirik. This, I think about it now and I can get these goosebumps. To listen to the singing here, and that everybody makes music here. This is something that I didn't experience in America. The art scene here seems to be very alive. But what I find a little bit troubling is what Estonia thinks of as being very modern and very experimental is by and large 50, 60 years behind the time. I wish that there was an awareness of the history of art here, because I think you can benefit from understanding how art has progressed in different cultures. Art opportunities are everybody, everywhere, anytime. I think you have to really work for them yourself. I spoke a little bit about social media platforms. There are plenty of traditional gallery spaces, but also plenty of non-traditional gallery spaces. And so I really think the artist needs to explore for themselves, where can they place their art? And if they're making art, think about the space in which the art can occur. Something that's a little bit sort of peculiar to me is I love the number of decaying and abandoned sites that I see in Estonia. These old buildings from Russian occupation that are no longer cared for are, to me, extremely beautiful. But I also realize they come with a history that I'm not aware of. But I would love to see art in these places. And I know that there are many opportunities for people to kind of work with the city and to work with the government to make things happen. So work hard for what you want and don't give up. It's easy to hear no. It's not easy to hear no. It's frequent to hear no. But don't let no stop you, because no stopped me a long time ago, and that is something I deeply regret. So what would I want the viewer to walk away with after looking at these works? Well, first I want you to look at the title of each work, because for me titles are very important. Titles are invitations to you, the viewer, into the work. They're not specifically telling you what I'm thinking about, but they're sort of invitations to say, I'm inviting you to think about these particular ideas as you look at this work. So you may see here dark weather patterns. You may find here the kind of twisted wires that you find in construction sites. You may find these sort of boat docks. These, I think you call them kai. These are also here. But the colors have to do with the sea, with the water. The colors also have to do with the buildings that are here in Noblessner, the shapes that I see here. So although they seem like they're abstractions, they're deeply connected. So what I'd like is, if you look at these works, go outside and find them, because they're all there. And you'll have a chance to go, I see this connection, and then come back and look again and see how I've shaped this kind of particular process. And the experience, I think, will be very wonderful.